Good afternoon, everybody. As Crystal said, our Resilient and Sustainable Land Use webinar covering zoning reform, climate risk, and the economics of the built environment is our fourth of our current resiliency webinar series hosted by AIA Florida. And this webinar explores how land use planning and zoning reform can enhance resilience, promote sustainability, and support the economic viability of our communities. And we have two speakers speaking to the subject today. One, speaking to the macro scale, is Dr. Philip Burke. And Philip is a research professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning and director of the Center for Resilient Communities and Environment, Institute for the Environment of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And his expertise covers urban resilience to hazards and climate change, focusing on the theory, methods, and metrics of city planning and implementation. He has published over 130 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and 10 books. He is the lead co-author of an internationally recognized book, Land Use Planning, which focuses on integrating principles of sustainable communities into urban form. And he is also the co-author of the book, Natural Hazard Mitigation, Recasting Disaster Policy and Planning, which was selected as one of the 100 essential books in planning of the 20th century by the American Planning Association. Speaking to the micro scale, we have Eric Kronberg as our second speaker, and Eric is a self-described zoning whisperer. He specializes in balancing and blending the often competing needs of urban design, architecture, and development in a potent cocktail for better places. He specializes in breaking down and demystifying regulations to find ways to help others navigate the redevelopment maze. He is a principal at Kronberg in Urbanists and Architects, leading the firm's practitioners to help our development partners create better places for all. His 7 years teaching for the Incremental Development Alliance motivated him to co-found Inc. Codes, an incremental code reform company helping mid-sized cities take the next step towards better places. All this work is directed towards making healthy neighborhoods, places that are vibrant, lasting, and inclusive. He recently joined the board of the Seaside Institute to help the leading think tank for the new urbanism strategically focus on how to integrate attainable housing into our great walkable places. So it's my great honor to have our two speakers with us. And Dr. Burke, if you could please take it away.
Thank you. I'm just going to get my screen set up here. Okay, is all good? Everybody can see?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay,
Good to go.
Okay, great. So what I would like to do today is introduce you to this tool. It's still a fairly new tool. It's called the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard. It's all about looking at the spatiality of plans and how they affect vulnerability of a community. And what I'm going to do is walk you through the problems as I see it in the multiple plans or networks of plans that even the smallest communities typically adopt, and then give you an overview of how the tool works, and then maybe a case study of an application in Norfolk, Virginia, where we actually worked with the local government, and then kind of tell you about the tool and its access and the various ways that you can maybe get training on it and so on. So what is the problem? And the problem is that local governments, it's not a problem if you adopt a number of plans, but they're often siloed. So a city or a community might, or a county might adopt a hazard mitigation plan. They all have to if they're going to get FEMA funding before and after a disaster, and they're required by FEMA. Other times it may be a transportation plan. You have to have one adopted and consistent with the Department of Transportation to get funding, housing plans, and so on. There also can be comprehensive plans and so on. So oftentimes they're isolated, and but they all, in one way or another, influence growth and development in a community. but here's the problem. This was before Hurricane Sandy hit in 2012 in the New York, New Jersey area. If you look at, this was the hazard mitigation plan on the left. It's of a community right on the coast that was severely damaged. And you look at the 100-year floodplain and you read the plan and it says this is severe repetitive loss that qualifies for FEMA buyouts. Then you look at the comprehensive plan on the right, the same geographic areas in purple, the purple areas there are potential economic revitalization areas. And the downtown is in the tan or the brown. And so there's all kinds of tools for investing in infrastructure, tax incentives, these kinds of things in the same geographic area as the buyouts. It's kind of like, where are we heading? What's the conflict? This is another case that's dear to my heart. I gave this talk and introduced the next 2 or 3 slides along with the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard in Asheville 1 year before Hurricane Helene. 2023, I gave this talk. If you look on the right, you'll see the blue areas are the 100-year floodplain. The tan, I believe, are the particularly on the right side of the French. This is the French Broad River running along Asheville. The tan's the 500-year flood. But if you look at the geometries are different, the spatial geometries here. But if you look at the figure on the left, that comes out of these 2 figures are in the comprehensive plan. But if you see, and you'll read the comprehensive plan, it says there's an innovation district for municipal services where they're going to try to jumpstart economic opportunities. They have the river arts as RAD. There's a strategic redevelopment opportunity area. There's HUD funding. Federal funding. I think it's HUD. And then there's the community wants to do traditional growth or transit-oriented. They have a form-based code in there. And this is right in the floodplain of the French Broad that was completely slammed. So a 30-foot wall of water came down. And if you look on the left here, here's the zoning. And if you look at the zoning, and they have a map there, and the same, you can see how they got commercial, residential, mixed use. They're trying to do neat things, livable kinds of built environments. Maybe it's smart growth in dumb locations. I don't know. Maybe that's the best way to put it. But and this is a year later, the River Arts District, and this is what it looked like. And I was there a couple of months ago, and there was a piece of artwork in a building that's gone. But anyway, on the right there. So that's kind of at the same time. If you read the comprehensive plan, it's got all this stuff in it that I mentioned. But if you read the hazard mitigation plan, where there's actual, and this is where FEMA funding goes through, the comprehensive plan, which was adopted in 2018, at the time there was the 2015 hazard mitigation plan operating. They update them every 5 years. The comprehensive plan never mentioned the hazard mitigation plan, never, not a word in it. And there are other issues too, but I just leave that as a highlight. So there was a French Broad River, but I guess there wasn't no floodplain. It wasn't think of a floodplain. So the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard, how does that work? This is a tool we developed about 7-8 years ago. It's won some awards research-wise, Homeland Security, their Office of Science and Technology, National Science Foundation. We've got a couple of, so we were happy on the academic side. And basically what we said was, step 1, this is the 3-step process. Step 1, you want to delineate the hazard zones in your community. I'm sitting on the Hudson River on a little town right on the edge, 18 inches above sea level, the downtown. So what you could do is outline on the step 1, where is the hazard? In this case, the hazard zones of the 100-year, and then we kind of overlaid the projected sea level rise in 2100, I believe. This was the NOAA intermediate risk standard that they were using. Step 2 is and then we look at different districts. That's what those numbers are for, neighborhoods in a community. Step 2 is we score plans. And I'll tell you how that works, but basically, are each policy in the plan promoting development and increasing maybe vulnerability, or are they reducing it? Are they adopting building codes or land use strategies or what have you, infrastructure that may increase or decrease vulnerability? So the brighter green, the better they're doing in this case, the more positive scores, the network of plans that are in place. And the darker colors, the downtown number one, for example, they're promoting a lot of streets, a complete street kind of this is a community in North Carolina, Little Washington, we call it, right on the coast. And then the third step is we then determine what the vulnerability is. And you could do social vulnerability, look at the equitable distribution of the vulnerability, how equitable it is. You could also be looking at, I guess, Florida, I can't say that word, the fairness maybe of what's going on in terms of social vulnerability. But and then there's the, you could look at physical vulnerability of the built environment, and then there are multiple ways to measure that. And I'm speaking to architects, I'm sure you're quite familiar with how that might work. But so, and I'm racing through this, but that step two was the other techniques are kind of in place, step one and step three, but step two here is the scorecard, how it works. What we do is we stack the plans on top of each other, and then we code the plans and the spatial implications of the different policies in the plans, okay? And we then actually develop a scoring system where if you're bright red, the red or light red, you're doing a lot to promote development, the policies. If you're blue or yellow, you're neutral. If you're blue, you're doing better. You're trying to reduce the vulnerabilities. And so what we try to do is then stack these three layers on top of each other, okay, from the three steps, in addition to the plan scores. So, so how does this work? We look at a list of policies. Every local government has to have a direction setting function, vision, goals, how are we going to get there in terms of policy guidance. And we look at each policy and determine what's its impact on vulnerability. And it doesn't have to be a policy have anything to do with hazards. It could say, put a park here, or it could say, put like what's behind me here, right on a foot above sea level on the Hudson River, put a maybe 20 unit per acre development. I don't know. And they got it's 2 or 3 stories, it varies, or 40 units. But anyway, and then is it place specific, the policy? Does it actually target a specific geographic area in the community? One of those districts in step one? Does it have a policy tool? We try to look at, governments have regulatory power, investment power, taxing power. There's also, and so we try to look at, are the tools that they use, and there's, dozens and dozens and dozens of these tools, but we try to look at how is that tool being used and so on. So we have a simple scoring system. I'll just show you how it works here. Basically, there's 3 policies written, typical in a comprehensive plan. One saying put a pedestrian-oriented urban areas with access to transit, like what Asheville is trying to do, but it's in the floodplain, okay, and a particular location. The policy on the bottom is saying maybe cluster development, use transfer development rights, or some to protect environmentally sensitive areas, including wetlands or maybe sensitive shoreline locations, and that's a +1. So you can be in each of the 2 districts, okay? The first policy may only apply to 1 district. The third policy there may apply to multiple districts. And then you could take each plan, score each area, okay? And then come up with an overall sum by geographic entity within a community. And you can see on the right here, the total score. So what we've done is we've actually gone around the world in doing this the last 8 years, I guess. And these are some of the locations. They're primarily research the first 4 or 5 years, and the last 3, 4 years we've been doing actually engaging communities. What's not shown is we're engaging communities in the wildfire zones in California. We also have a heat mitigation initiative going on, and that's been in Arizona, as well as Tokyo. I'm not sure that's on, and we've done research in some of the other areas. It's really from the Netherlands to China and so on. So we've kind of, it's taken off, it's gotten busy. This is out of date here, the map, but I just want to give you a sense of what we're using. So what is this tool? It's been fascinating because I can sit in a university and produce all these articles, which we have, and and that's all fine. But what we wanted to do, my colleagues and I, uh, create a plan. We wanted to create a guidebook for local government. After we went through 3 pilot communities, we thought, let's kind of pull something together for local governments. And so what we've done is when we engage a local government, we wrote the guidebook and we wanted to pilot test it, trial it out. We originally did 3 communities. And what we do is we develop a covenant of working with the local government. They have certain responsibilities, but we have a technical team that may address assisting with scoring, helping assess the vulnerability of this, or advising on policy solutions where there might be conflicts or opportunities, different geographic areas to improve the work that you're doing in terms of long-range planning, looking ahead. And then we ask the community. They have to actually, we ask if they could contribute staff time to participate in the training. And if not all the plans, we try to ask them to evaluate. We try to look at 3 or 4 plans in the community, the most influential that the community feels is in terms of guiding development. Many of them aren't, as we well know, but anyway, and they actually try to get them to self-evaluate the plans at a minimum, at least one of the plans, so that they can actually get a feel for what it is we're doing. So the guidebook, we had, I just want to mention, a great group. It was, the first draft was created 5 years ago, and I am so thankful. We had an amazing group of people on the advisory committee. And it's just kind of, from fire protection folks to consulting firms and planning to the American Planning Association and the Association of State Floodplain Managers, which are a fantastic group. Thank you, group. So anyway, this is a boring figure, but basically when we engage a community, what we do is we try to, the inputs are, we provide technical assistance, in-kind contributions and that type of thing. We do the training, we educate stakeholders, oftentimes get involved, interest groups beyond the staff, the city staff. And we try to come up with, here's a new database. When you're done, you might have, new technologies that you may incorporate. And it's amazing when we work with the local communities, they'll adapt the tool. They'll upgrade it or downgrade it, but I don't mean downgrade and make it worse. They fit their capacity and their need and what they can do. And they'll change, the outcomes might be changing plans, not just the plan that they're evaluating, but the network so that they get them working together. They may be changing actually standards, incentives, investment priorities, the regulations and so on. And they actually, if we like to look back over time, are they actually, some of this led to actual vulnerability reduction in the community? So this is Norfolk. And we went in, Norfolk applied the plan. They looked at mainly a suite of plans, but I'm just going to highlight 2 here. They looked at their capital improvements program and their comprehensive plan and their hazard mitigation plan, and they're a Rockefeller Resilience 100 city. So they're kind of in the vanguard in a lot of this thinking. And they found that 27 policies in the plans had to be adapted, amended to better align with what the other plans were doing, the good stuff of the other plans, like the hazard mitigation plan said, retrofitting structures, the Vision 2100 Rockefeller Center resilient city effort. They're trying to do a gradual retreat and infill and revitalization in the higher elevations of the city. They also changed some of their land use regulations and their capital improvements programs in terms of the standards for citing new investments. So one of the things that they did do, they created this new policy base, their success story. They had a lot of, what we find is not this, they don't, we love the fancy maps and the coding and all that, but they'll consistently say they're siloed in the way they think, even the smallest local governments. And it gets them to communicate and do cross-agency communication. And that's over and over when we kind of do these post-evaluation efforts. We try to look at what happened and what do they feel were some of the strengths of applying the scorecard. And what they did do is they did a social vulnerability map using census data. It's not hard. Where low income folks live, where, where the people that may not own a car live if they can't evacuate, if there are difficulties. And they found that 2 districts in the community got an area, 2 neighborhoods had the lowest scores, were the most vulnerable in terms of social vulnerability. And they were in the 100-year flood, in the sea level rise area. And so what they did was, when they developed applied the scorecard and got their plans integrated and had a better platform, they could demonstrate when they wrote proposals, like to HUD, they got a $112 million grant to build a resilience park in this area. And did some relocation that's always sensitive. And I like to think of it as community driven. I think that was up and down there. It can be top down, but they did get a resilience park in the neighborhood. It has lots of different types of benefits. And I think they always felt, and in the reviews they got when they applied, we have our act together. We know where we're heading as a community. And so we're not, this is kind of an integrated effort that we've gone through. And here's just an example of how we try to get the local, particularly the agency staff, to work together. From the police department, you see sitting there at the bottom on the right, to the city planner, Mr. Homewood, to staff on the above from our from our group. And you can see his quote here that it was a good tool. So basically, what we try to do to end up here is we try to equip people with knowledge, not just data, right? We try to focus on the neighborhood scale because there's a spatial presence. Y'all are architects and you do design. We often think we try to do a land use design in a community at the land use scale, and then try to get that so it fits. There's tailored and specific, but it fits neighborhoods. It's adaptable to fit the neighborhoods. And we also look at all policies in the plans, not just stuff that would be, are they doing green infrastructure? But we look at all policies, so look at the hidden effects of vulnerability. And we try to make it practical, worthwhile, and we try to nudge, don't shove. And some places like Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission worked with all their local governments, and they kind of adapted the scoring system where they said, it's too much for look at all the spatial, but we just want to read the plans and find out what plans are promoting development and what aren't. But we can't do all the GIS. There's some very small communities there. So, and it works, and there's different ways. So if you're interested, there's a website called planintegration.com. And there's the guidebook. There's also a guidebook for heat resilience. Same approach, but there's a group at Arizona State University that developed it. They got I've worked with there. That guidebook is in the website. We have case studies that show we've worked in a whole series of cities and communities. It's ongoing, and we don't know now. We're losing track, like the Wisconsin group I found last month, that they had applied it. We didn't know, so I think it's being applied more than we know. And then there's lots of research and publications, and there's also a training webinar. It's, I think, might be 3-hour training webinar of the American Planning Association. So my colleagues are, these are my colleagues who I work with. I went back to Texas A&M for a few years and we developed this, but I've been a longtime faculty member at the University of North Carolina. And so these are just some of my colleagues that we work with. So what we do is we have researchers, and then we have people that know how to do practice. It's great because Texas A&M is a land grant. And but anyway, I think it's critical that in developing the tool and getting it to pilot tested in the communities, that was really critical to do that. And we feel now that the practice is kind of leading the way now, not so much the application. But anyway, thank you for giving me a chance to give my talk. And I will stop sharing, right?
Yep. Philip, that was great. So as I'm getting set up, my presentation is very much going to be about once you know the right places to promote development that are climate appropriate, I'm going to talk about how to facilitate and encourage that. So That's why Philip went first. So Eric Kronberg here. I'm going to run through this relatively quickly, but all our presentations, the video will be shared. We have our presentations online. We're a multidisciplinary team. We play in various sandboxes, but all our goals are to make flourishing neighborhoods, to make them more equitable and attainable primarily. And so we position ourselves to be partners for inclusive places, lasting places, and vibrant places. But really, we're mostly focused on making attainable places for all. Like that's what gets us up every day. And so we play with a lot of different pieces of the puzzle. We spend a lot of time thinking about urban design, Main Street redevelopment, housing choice, which is a range of choices beyond just single family and big multifamily. We spend a lot of time on development guidance with our clients. Implementation really matters, and understanding how to get things built is something we also spend a lot of time thinking about. And ultimately, without the right zoning and policy, it's really hard to make these things happen. So that's why we spend a lot of time with better policies for cities to get to better outcomes as well. So we put all these pieces together to get to where we're going. We also spend a lot of time thinking about all the different sectors that require resources to do development. And as architects and urban designers, we'd like to see as much of that resource go to the bottom right quadrant, the design quadrant, as possible, which means we have to be really thoughtful on these other three quadrants to make sure they don't overwhelm from a cost standpoint to make things happen. And so we start with the question of what does a financially and environmentally sustainable development pattern look like? A lot of what we're going to talk about is going to be through the lens of financial and social sustainability. But at the end of the day, like I said, it's flourishing neighborhoods that are vibrant, inclusive, and lasting. That's what we're about, and that's what we're focusing on. Couple things from Conversation to Urbanism. I spent a lot of time with these folks too. The point is we've got a lot of challenges right now between climate change, racial and social equity, public health. They're all highly interrelated, and trying to address all three is an appropriate response whenever we can. And that compact walkable places encourage transit use are potentially the most comprehensive, effective way to do this, right? Both for mitigation and adaptation. And the magnitude of climate change is even greater than sprawl, and we need more partners to do this, and it has to be a very cross-sector approach, right? We need all hands on deck to tackle these problems. And one of the things I want to start with, because to help frame this from a resiliency standpoint, this is from Our World in Data. This is for the United States. Over time, we spend 3 times as much energy and resources on transportation than buildings. I was looking at the global trends. It's almost equal transportation and buildings globally, but we are such a drive-only environment in America that this means we're burning way more fossil fuels to get ourselves around. And when you look at how we get to work, which is one of the ways we tend to drive the most in America, this is from the University of Michigan, the vast majority of Americans are driving alone. I'm in that little tiny bike sliver down there. This is core and interrelated and a good setup for what we're going to talk about. So we always like to ask, why do you think sustainable communities are so hard to provide? Why do you think attainable communities are so hard to provide too? I mean, our development policies are core, and we also overlay this with the housing crisis we're facing from an attainability standpoint. And so again, attainability, it's all hard. For us in America, these are the 5 components of any development project, right? The 5 L's we like to talk about. And generally speaking, locally, it is our local ordinances and laws that we can control. I will say that we highlighted land here, though, because more and more cities are finally realizing they've got a lot of municipal owned property that they can get off the shelves and into redevelopment in appropriate ways to facilitate better outcomes. But land, in terms of a project budget, is usually 10 to 20% of a total project cost. Our laws contribute 25 to 40% of the vertical construction costs. So the laws have a disproportionate outcome as to what can happen on a site. Free land helps, but it can't overcome bad policy. So that's what motivated us to found Incos, like I said before, a woman-owned firm that helps drive education, piloting, and policy change. And again, it's that incremental change of piloting first to get the laws to change later. And we're going to talk about this through the lens of zoning today, primarily in terms of sustainability and attainability. But I want to do a little bit of context setting because demographics matter, right? Who are we today? What does this mean? We're going to start with the typical American housing mismatch, and we're looking at some housing crisis statistics just to ground ourselves. So from a mismatch standpoint, right now, this is actually 2018 data. Every time we run this, it gets more and more intense. But we're not traditional nuclear families by and large. The American household formations are very diverse. You've got more than a quarter of households are singles living alone, 25% couples with no kids, and some adult roommates. 20% are just traditional families. And when we look at how we've changed over time, this is from ARP, in the 1950s, we had less than 300 square feet per person per house. That's a relatively efficient use of building to house humans. By 2017, we'd bloated to more than 1,000 square feet per person, a 3.5 times increase. It's no wonder housing's expensive when you build it this big. The other thing we like to talk about with demographic changes in household sizes is in the 1950s, we were nearly 4 people per household. So nominally, you could house 8 people in 2 houses. As we change from 3.8 to 2.5, trending towards 2.0 people per household, you need a lot more houses to house the same number of people. The question is, what kind of policy do we want to promote? Do we want to only allow large format single family housing and drive only environments to house the same number of people? Or do we want to look at policies that are more compact, more together, and right sizing our housing choices and our attainability for the households we have today? As Florida well knows, a disproportionate number of our households will be senior citizens, particularly the over 80 population. And as you look at aging per life stage, those older households will disproportionately be 1 to 2 people per household. Like that's just basic math. And so these are ways to think about the different kinds of households, from downsizing and on, but downsizing continues to grow. And as you look at the baby boom generation, as they are simply moving through from peak household, having kids from the 1980s to 2010s, they're now moving into downsizing households, right? Significantly, really driving our housing needs and our housing trends. We also like to talk about, how we change and increase housing options. Unfortunately, in 2012, more than 68% of our housing was single family starts. And by 2022, we're up to 70%. When you only legalize single family starts as a primary land use component, these are the outcomes you get. The other thing I'd like to talk about for attainability and size is that in the 1970s, 40% of the houses we built were less than 1,400 square feet. They were starter homes, they were attainable. We're less than 10%, hover around 8% of homes less than 1,400 square feet right now. That, again, is a direct response to our housing policy and our land use laws. Again, when you look at household formations, 20% nuclear family, total housing stock in America, over 72% are large format single family homes, is a complete mismatch from family formation size to housing stock in this country. We can look about walkability as a preference. By and large, from a range of NAR surveys and otherwise, most of these household ranges prefer to live in walkable neighborhoods when they can, but most don't because there's not enough supply, which drives up the prices. So we like to point out that, there's not nearly as much walkable housing stock in America from a neighborhood land use standpoint. Most of it's conventional single family drive only. That's a challenge. We need to figure out how we're going to turn the tide and get to better outcomes. But we also like to point out there's a lot more room for housing options inside these walkable neighborhoods or potentially walkable neighborhoods through better policy. And one house per standard lot isn't going to get us there no matter how hard we try. And so a lack of the right kind of supply and a growing demand results in rising costs. This is economics 101. And the lack of the right kind of regulations mean we're building a sprawling, unsustainable, unattainable mess. So a few more statistics. We all know rents and home prices over the past 30 years have been spiking. Incomes haven't kept up. People that are cost burdened continue to rise. More than a third of American households, this is from Harvard the past year. We also like to point out just basic math. If you're making $15 an hour, you're making $30,000 a year, give or take. You're trying to find a rent for $800 a month or less. That is really scarce in most of America. And what happens is when there's not enough homes being built, all those folks at the top of the ladder with the higher incomes, when they're facing scarcity, they tend to buy down the ladder to other neighborhoods and pushing other people down the ladder and down the ladder until you get to these lower rungs and there's just no more housing. This is what happens every day in America with our current policies. Again, cost burden metrics I want to talk about because this is going to tie back to sustainability. HUD defines if you spend more than 30% of your income on housing, your cost burden, but they also define that you spend more than 50% of your income on housing plus transportation, your cost burdened. Another way to say that is if you spend more than 20% of your housing and transportation, 20% of your income on transportation, you're also burdened. When I talk about housing and percents and area median income, this is just a quick spread of the words we like to use between affordable, attainable, and market rate. And again, the point for a median is that 100% of AMI means that half the people in your town make more money than that, half make less. This is not an average, it's the median. Again, 20% goes to transportation, your cost burdened. That means if you're only making 30 grand, you need to be spending no more than about 500 bucks a month on getting around. And per AAA, it costs about 890 to 1250 bucks a month for true cost of vehicle ownership. I pull their data because they're the most pro car group I can find. So you need to be making over 50 grand a year not to be cost burdened by owning a car. What are we doing with our built environment, around these transportation issues? If you're a 2-car household, it's double. And I like to point out that every zoning required parking space equals a less walkable, less inclusive community. This is what this looks like. These are standard parking requirements for standard 1-story uses on a standard lot, for office, retail, restaurants, and bars. These are the built outcomes of our regulations today. There is no way to make an attainable, inclusive community with these kinds of policies. So the question is, how do we find something that's more attainable, more walkable, less car dependent, without a big pot of outside subsidy? And what really matters is where and how to focus our efforts. So start with Philip's scoring maps to figure out the climate resilient places in your town, and we'll talk about how to do that. And we're going to start with talking about the cost of not doing that from a low density approach. So we like to point out that low density development patterns seem easy, seem cheap. They're bankrupting your city in the long run. Because here's what happens. Everybody wants stable services, everyone wants low density, and we'd all like to pay low taxes. The thing is, that middle doesn't exist. Everything's a trade-off. And if you'd like lower taxes and stable services, you're going to have more revenue through more density to pay for that stuff. That's where we spend our time. And again, more infrastructure, less tax revenue is just a really huge disaster for cities, particularly Florida cities that have additional coastal resilience challenges they have to pay for beyond the typical upkeep of pipes and roads and sewers. And what this looks like playing out with the standard, this is a larger format lot. These are 50 or 100 by 150 lots. Each of these lots generate property taxes to support the infrastructure that includes the stuff we see like sidewalks, curbs, trees, utility poles, traffic lights, street lights if you're lucky, and then the underground stuff like water, sewer, storm, hopefully it's separated in your town, and the paving, right? That's a lot of physical infrastructure that the revenues from these properties should be supporting. But there's also the services, right? Police, fire, schools, and trash. And most of the time, the property taxes may not even cover the services, let alone a capital reserve to improve all this other stuff as well. This is a huge challenge, right? This is why we're going broke as a nation. Through policy and infill projections, this is a 6x amount of infill of the same land, providing a lot more tax value for the same land with no more infrastructure and a negligible increase in services. This is what changing policy looks like to get better outcomes that's more inclusive for people. This can happen through a range of accessory dwelling unit policies for attached and detached, 2-family housing. I like to joke that we like to call, attached accessory dwelling units a way sexier form of duplex because they're both 2-family dwellings, and duplex is a 4-letter word in a lot of places. So pick your words carefully. A lot of the stuff I'm showing you comes from Urban 3. They do great work out of Asheville, North Carolina, and Strong Towns. These two groups have really pioneered the way of analyzing your stuff from a tax value per acre standpoint and reframing how cities need to think about density to be a stronger surviving place. Now, in order to get to a more mobile-rich, car optional situation, it takes some work and it takes some analysis and picking your places carefully. Our method and approach is to focus on near downtowns and small towns, near neighborhood centers in larger cities, but places that have some potential to be walkable because there's goods and services in a nearby fashion that's not in a drive-only suburban sprawl component. And we have to point out that if you can get in your car to drive a quarter mile, you'll probably keep going because then it's a question of how easy is it to park. So making it easier to make it car optional is critical to get to these positive outcomes. And so when you think about your towns, where should you think about this stuff can happen? Our cheat for city officials is it's called our Sanborn scan. Think about your favorite part of town. Odds are it's probably built before 1929, before Black Monday. And because back then it was car light, there was no zoning, and there was no subsidy for the development pattern, which meant it was mobility flexible, it was use flexible, and it had to be cost conscious because there was no HUD funding to do this, that, or the other. And so these ended up being incrementally built, walkable mixed-use places that were attainable. And so examples of this, I've got Defuniak Springs up on the left and Gainesville on the right. These are 1920 Sanborn maps. This is from the title page. This is showing what was mostly built out at the time. These are going to be your walkable core neighborhoods. We're not saying that you're going to build right on the town square or in the core of something, but these neighborhoods that are within a half mile, quarter mile of this core, these are typically the neighbors that have the mobility components I'm going to talk about that have a chance to handle better outcomes and this increase in housing choice. Again, this kind of grid and fabric, there's options that we can help with. If this is your development pattern, I really don't have anything for you. I'm sorry. So we also like to point out that the regulations that created sprawl are not appropriate for fabric when you look at these two things. And what I mean by that is these 1960s regulations that ended up with these outcomes were often applied to these areas in the 1980s and 70s post fair housing laws. So right sizing solutions, what does this look like? We always preach to folks, architects, hope you understand this. Whenever you're building under an international building code, it's going to be a lot more expensive and a lot more complex and a lot more just difficult than when you're building under the residential code, right? IRC is simple. Simple builders can build this stuff, less sprinkler requirements. So if you're trying to think about attainability, understanding the difference between these two sets of regulations is a big deal. Why? It's simply cost. This was taken. I love this chart. Michael Erickson, Anthony Orlando, Michael's from Purdue, Anthony's from UC Pomona. Spent a lot of time looking at the cost per square foot per story of multifamily. I took their data, pulled it forward from 2018 to 2024 with some construction inflation, and converted it from just per square foot to the size of one 800 square foot apartment for just the building component, nothing else. And then I added the cost of one parking space because that was something I felt I could capture and know. Soft costs, land costs, other kinds of costs are not included in these costs. These are high and low estimates. You should all recognize the huge spike when you go to high rise, but you can see that 2 to 3 story walk up. This is our traditional garden apartment, more cost effective than the wrap deck components, and most efficient of all from a building cost standpoint are small format cottages. Now, land price can really distort these things, but what I want to explain to you from an old school development trick is that more or less $100 of project cost can be supported by $1 monthly revenue when you're talking about a for rent situation. Or you could flip that around, say for every dollar you can earn in rent, you can afford $100 in project cost. Very interest rate sensitive, but at least gets you in the ballpark of what project viability looks like. And so these are the components of the building, $100 of cost. Those are your rents. This is the relationship between the two. We spend all our time trying to figure out how to get the most out of this because this stuff is just too expensive to ever be attainable without a whole bunch of subsidy. All right. So this means we talk a lot about ADU strategies, about this infill, about where do people go, how do they fit in. This is how you go from a handful of houses and not enough people having housing choice to having a community filled in with the ability to support local restaurants, businesses, goods and services in close proximity. So we talk about ADUs from accessory, detached. We love the term the ADU plex, a duplex ADU. That's something that Durham has allowed. A few more cities are starting to allow that. Great ways to expand policy outcomes for your place. And this is how this can happen. One of the things we also talk about with ADUs is they can be hard to finance because it usually takes a second position to get a loan for those. We're encouraging a lot of cities to rethink minimum lot size and allow lot splits so the ADUs can happen in a fee simple fashion. This really simplifies financing. This really increases opportunities for builders to provide more housing with the same amount of land. It gets us more dense, more compact, more sustainable in the places we are, and essentially requires the building of smaller houses due to the ADU requirements on size and height. And this is how these things work to increase and infill the neighborhood as we go. Quick case study. This was a existing house right here, existing house right here. This was infill with some 2-family and some ADUs in Atlanta I did as a self-development project. So this is what happens when you build for rent with existing policy with some good ADU allowances. This is what this looks like in the backyard. Half of these are attainable, workforce rents, there's no subsidy involved in this. This is the kind of stuff that policy can do. ADUs increase independence of older homeowners, increase ability to downsize, increase supply of attainable housing, supports neighborhood scale businesses, better return on existing infrastructure, big deal for compact growth. So the policies we love to find, I'm going to skip over why I'm running out of time. It's hard to finance, like I said, but Strong Towns has a great housing ready checklist that they talk about. These are 6 steps that you should really focus on to promote housing and accessibility and attainability in your town. I'm going to go through them one by one. Allow single families to convert to duplex or triplex by right. Allowing a duplex, yes. Triplex, no. That's IBC. Allowing duplex plus an ADU in the backyard is a lot better way to do that. Permit backyard cottages in all residential zones. Yep. Repeal parking mandates for housing. Yes. Promote places with more housing choices, particularly these older neighbors with on-street parking. Legalize starter homes in all residential zones. Fee simple ADUs are a really effective way to do that. Eliminate minimum lot size in existing neighborhoods. Fee simple ADUs are a really good way to do that. Streamline the approval process. God help us, every city for everything every day. That takes resources, though. That takes training. That takes staff. That means you need more money in your building department and better people to help make that work. You need more tax revenues to make that happen. So quick things for Durham. I love to shout them out. They did some great policy in 2019. Grounded this in economic development and racial disparity, how they need to right some wrongs. They now allow small lot, so you can take a standard 50 by 150 lot, do a small lot in the front and a flag in the back. These two blue circled things could be sold separately. This can be two family. Oops, I'm sorry. That can have an ADU, home and ADU. So you can have 5 homes on what was one standard lot. Some height limitations, duplexes, limitations there. That's fine. That small lot has to be at least 2,000 square feet, but you're usually starting about 7,500. This is what that looks like for the flagpole. They specifically allow these. We always encourage a 5-foot flag, which is not enough for utilities, but often means you can preserve the house. And we say do the 5-foot flag, but if you need more space for utilities, allow an easement to take care of that. In Atlanta, we've got some policy things that can do this similarly, which is how that case study exists that I showed you, but we can't sell these separately. The more you can sell separately, the more builders can build and sell. They're more inclined to do that. Building to rent is really hard. And then Durham upped their game with a few more things I'd like to share. They allow now unlimited ADUs on faith property. Yes, in God's backyard. It's pretty awesome. This is a phenomenal way to legalize housing without additional permissions for faith institutions to do this. And these are a few examples from the Faith-Based Housing Institute to show what you could do with leftover church land. Like, this doesn't suck. This is pretty cool stuff from policy to allow better outcomes to happen. Washington State, I'm going really fast, had some great stuff over this past year in particular. They now what I really like is that you allow a lot splits by right, basically fee simple ADUs, and accountability for local governments to add housing and small scale condo risk reduction. Y'all should think about that in Florida. And then some landmarks that says you limit how you can use historic preservation to block housing. And more housing type innovation, a lot of subdivisions, awesome. That is my sprint. I did almost on time. You stop sharing.